I'm sending this in because I need to get it out of my head. I've heard people on your channel talk about gut feelings and primal fear, and I always thought it was just dramatic storytelling. I don't think that anymore. I'm a land surveyor by trade. I spend half my life alone in the woods dealing with difficult terrain, bad weather, and the occasional bear. I'm not someone who gets spooked by a snapping twig. But what happened up in the Cascades last month? That was something different. That wasn't nature. It started with a job offer that was honestly too good to turn down. A private holding company contacted me to survey a 400-acre plot in the Northern Cascades, the Blackwood Tract. They offered triple my usual rate, provided I could start immediately and finish within 5 days. The only catch was the location. It was deep. We're talking 3 hours past the last cell tower, down a network of logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the Carter administration. I packed my Jeep with my gear, total station, tripods, camping supplies, and enough freeze-dried food for a week, and headed out on a Tuesday morning. By the time I hit the gravel turnoff, the gray Washington sky had lowered itself onto the treetops, turning the world into a tunnel of fog and evergreen. The drive-in was brutal. The road was barely a scar in the earth, choked with ferns and washed out by decades of rain. My Jeep bottomed out twice, the undercarriage screaming against hidden rocks. It took me 4 hours to cover the last 20 miles. By the time I reached the coordinates for the base camp, an old clearing where the logging company used to have their main office, the sun was already dipping below the ridgeline. The isolation hit me the second I killed the engine. Usually, the woods are noisy. You hear birds, wind, insects, the shifting of trees. But here, it was dead silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a room where an argument just ended. It felt heavy, like the air was thicker than it should be. I stepped out, my boots sinking into mud that smelled pungently of rot and pine needles. The clearing was dominated by the remains of the old logging office. It was a single-story wooden structure, the roof caved in on one side, swallowed by moss so thick it looked like green fur. It looked like the earth was trying to digest the building. I decided to set up my tent near the Jeep rather than risk sleeping near that unstable ruin. As I was hammering in the tent stakes, I got that feeling. You know the one, the prickly heat on the back of your neck, the sensation that if you turn around too fast, you'll catch something looking at you. I stood up, gripping my mallet, and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just the endless vertical prison bars of Douglas firs fading into the mist. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded flat, swallowed instantly by the moss. I shook it off. Isolation jitters, I told myself. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to do a quick perimeter check before it got fully dark. I walked toward the edge of the clearing where the old logging road continued deeper into the tract. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards from my Jeep, nailed to the trunk of a massive cedar tree, was a sign. It wasn't one of the old rusted metal signs from the logging era. It was a piece of plywood, looking relatively fresh, maybe a year or two old at most. The edges were jagged, like it had been snapped rather than cut. Painted on it in thick, black, dripping spray paint were 3 words: "Do not speak." I stared at it, the beam of my flashlight trembling just a little. It was weird, sure, probably some kids or hunters trying to spook trespassers, but looking at it made my stomach turn. The paint looked aggressive, frantic. I turned away, heading back to my tent, trying to rationalize it. I told myself I'd just do the job and get out. I climbed into my sleeping bag, exhausted from the drive. I eventually drifted off, listening to the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of rain starting to hit the canvas. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I didn't wake up groggy. I woke up wide awake, heart hammering, adrenaline flooding my veins. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears against the sound of the rain. Then I heard it. It was faint, coming from outside, somewhere near the old ruined cabin. It was the sound of a zipper. Zip. Then a pause. Zip. It sounded exactly like the zipper on my tent fly, but my tent was closed. I was alone. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my pillow, and waited. Then, inches from my ear, separated only by the thin nylon wall of the tent, a voice whispered, It wasn't a human voice. It sounded flat, metallic, like a recording played on a bad tape deck. It whispered, "Hello? Hello? Is anyone there?" My blood froze. It wasn't just a voice. It was my voice. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I lay there in the dark, my hand cramping around the handle of my knife, staring up at the invisible ceiling of the tent. My brain was trying to process the impossibility of what I had just heard. It was my voice, my pitch, my cadence, the exact flat tone I use when I'm testing audio equipment, but it was coming from outside, in the rain. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It repeated the phrase a third time. This time, the intonation was different. It didn't sound like a question anymore. It sounded like a statement. It was testing the words, rolling them around in a mouth that didn't know how to use them. Then, silence. I waited for footsteps. I waited for the crunch of gravel or the sucking sound of boots in mud. But there was nothing, just the rain. It was as if the speaker had simply evaporated. I stayed awake until the gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the nylon. I didn't unzip that door until I could see the silhouette of my hand in front of my face. When I finally crawled out, knife raised, the campsite was empty. The mist was thicker than the day before, clinging to the ground like spider webs. I circled the tent, looking for tracks. The rain had washed the ground into a slurry, destroying any clear prints, but on the side of the tent where I'd heard the voice, the mud was disturbed. It wasn't a footprint. It looked like someone, or something, had dragged a heavy sack across the earth, a wide, smooth furrow that vanished into the brush. I stood there, shivering in the morning chill, debating whether to pack up and leave. But the logic of daylight is a powerful thing. Standing there with my coffee, watching the sun try to burn off the fog, I started to rationalize. Maybe it was a radio glitch, I thought. Maybe I left a voice memo playing on my phone. It sounded stupid, but I needed the money. I had a mortgage that was underwater and debts that weren't going away. I couldn't bail on a $15,000 contract because of a nightmare. I forced myself to work. I grabbed the total station, a heavy yellow tripod-mounted laser scanner, and a prism pole and headed for the first corner marker on the map. The work was grueling. The Blackwood Tract was a mess of ravines and dense deadfall. I had to hack my way through blackberry brambles that tore at my canvas pants. Every 100 yards, I'd set up the tripod, shoot a laser to the prism, and log the data. Usually, I get into a flow state when I work, but not today. Every time I looked through the viewfinder of the total station, I expected to see someone standing in the crosshairs. The silence of the woods felt attentive. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking? The whole forest felt like that. Around 1 p.m., I reached the northeast quadrant. According to the old maps, this area was supposed to be clear-cut forest. Instead, I found myself in a grove of ancient, twisted cedars that looked like they'd been strangling each other for centuries. I was hammering a wooden stake into the ground to mark a boundary line when I smelled it. It wasn't the smell of pine or rain. It was the smell of copper, wet, metallic, and old, like a butcher shop that hasn't been cleaned in a week. I stood up, wiping sweat from my forehead, and looked around. The smell was coming from a dense thicket of ferns to my left. I hesitated, then pushed through the foliage, my prism pole held out like a spear. I broke through the ferns and stopped cold. I wasn't the first surveyor here. In the center of a small natural clearing sat a tripod. It was old, rusted, and covered in lichen, looking like it had been standing there for 30 years. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Mounted on top of the tripod wasn't a camera or a laser scanner. Someone had taken a deer's skull, bleached white and stripped of flesh, and lashed it to the mounting plate with orange surveyor's flagging tape. The skull was positioned perfectly level, staring straight down the survey line I was currently mapping. I stepped closer, the smell of rot overwhelming now. That's when I noticed the details. The eye sockets of the skull were filled with black mud, and stuck into the mud like perverse pupils were two small round objects. I leaned in, squinting, my breath hitched in my throat. They were batteries, AA batteries, the kind I used for my headlamp. I stumbled back, my boot catching on a root. As I scrambled to regain my balance, I saw something else lying at the base of the tripod. It was a yellow helmet, cracked down the middle. I reached down and turned it over with the tip of my boot.
Written on the inside brim in faded permanent marker was a name, D.M. Miller. My stomach dropped. I knew that name. David Miller was a surveyor from my local union. He'd gone missing 3 years ago. The official story was that he had a breakdown and skipped town. But here was his hat. And deeper in the gloom, beyond the tripod, I saw something orange hanging from a branch. It was a safety vest. And it was moving. Not from the wind. There was no wind. The vest was swaying rhythmically, back and forth, as if someone invisible was wearing it, gently rocking themselves to sleep.
I didn't just leave. I ran. I grabbed my prism pole and scrambled backward, tearing through the ferns until I hit the main survey line. My heart was slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. The logical part of my brain, the part that calculates angles and distances, was shouting at me to calm down. It's just trash, it said. It's just old gear someone left behind. But the primal part knew better. That vest wasn't swaying from the wind. It was swaying with intent. I made it back to the clearing where my Jeep was parked in record time, my breath coming in jagged gasps. The sun was still high, maybe 3 p.m., but the light in the woods felt wrong. It was thin, watery, like the forest was absorbing the sunlight before it could hit the ground. I threw my gear into the back of the Jeep, my hands shaking so bad I dropped my keys twice. I was done. 15 grand wasn't worth this. I was going to drive out to the main road, call the cops, and report finding David Miller's gear. Let them deal with whatever sick joke was playing out in these woods. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. Click. Nothing. No crank, no sputter, just the dead, hollow click of a solenoid failing to engage. I tried again. Click. "Come on," I whispered, panic rising in my throat like bile. "Don't do this." I checked the dashboard. The battery light was on, but the voltage meter read 12.4 volts. It wasn't the battery. It was something electrical. I popped the hood, praying it was just a loose terminal. Under the hood, everything looked fine. No chewed wires, no corrosion. I wiggled the battery cables, checked the starter relay. Nothing seemed out of place. I got back in and tried again. Click. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, screaming in frustration. I was stranded, 20 miles from a paved road, 3 hours from cell service, with a dead Jeep and a dead man's hard hat waiting for me in the woods. I sat there for a long time, listening to the engine cool, the metal ticking in the silence. The sun was starting to dip lower, dragging long shadows across the clearing. I realized with a sick feeling that I wasn't going anywhere tonight. I had to secure the camp. I spent the next hour fortifying my position. I moved my tent closer to the Jeep, creating a sort of barricade with the vehicle in a large fallen log. I gathered firewood, lots of it, and built a fire ring 3 times the size I usually would. Fire was primal. Fire kept the dark away. As dusk settled, the fog rolled back in, thicker than before. It muffled everything. I sat by the fire, whittling a stick into a sharp point, my eyes darting to the tree line every few seconds. Around 8 p.m., I decided to check my audio recorder. I always carry a digital voice recorder for field notes, coordinates, terrain descriptions, that kind of thing. I pulled it out of my vest pocket and hit play, intending to review my notes from the morning. The first few entries were normal. My voice, calm and professional, listing coordinates and complaining about the mud. Point 104, elevation 890, heavy brush to the west. Recommend clearing crew before construction. Then came the static. It wasn't normal white noise. It was rhythmic. Ch, 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 like heavy breathing. I frowned and fast-forwarded. The next entry was time-stamped for 1:43 p.m., right around the time I found Miller's gear. I hadn't recorded anything then. I had been running. I pressed play. Silence. Then a wet, squelching sound, like footsteps in deep mud. Closer. Closer. Then a voice. It wasn't my voice this time. It wasn't the metallic mimicry I'd heard in the tent. It was David Miller's voice. I knew David. We'd had beers at the Union Hall.
He had a distinct gravelly laugh. And on the recording, clear as day, I heard him laugh, a dry, wheezing chuckle that ended in a cough. "Hey, buddy, you looking for me? I'm right here." The recording cut to static. I stared at the device in my hand, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't recorded that. I hadn't even touched the recorder since before lunch. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, from the exact spot where the old logging road vanished into the trees, a voice called out. "Hey, buddy." It was the same voice, David's voice, but it sounded stretched, like someone playing a 45 RPM record at 33. "You looking for me?" I scrambled back, kicking the fire, sending sparks flying into the night. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. Standing just beyond the reach of the light, half obscured by a massive fir tree, was a figure. It was wearing a safety vest, an orange safety vest, and it was waving. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was standing about 50 yards away, just at the edge of the clearing where the logging road disappeared into the dense undergrowth. The orange vest was bright against the darkness, almost glowing in the faint light of my dying fire. "David?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is that you?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, swaying slightly, like a pendulum caught in a gentle breeze. Then, slowly, it raised a hand. It wasn't a wave. It was a beckoning motion, a stiff, unnatural curl of the fingers, over and over again. "Come here." I took a step back, my boots crunching on the gravel. "David, listen to me. I'm armed. Stay where you are." The figure stopped swaying. It tilted its head to the side at an impossible angle, almost 90 degrees, like a curious bird. Then it spoke. "I'm armed. Stay where you are." It wasn't David's voice anymore. It was mine. It was a perfect recording of what I had just said, down to the trembling catch in my throat. But there was something wrong with the playback. It was layered. Behind my voice, faint but distinct, was the sound of heavy machinery? A low, grinding hum, like gears turning deep underground. I didn't wait to hear more. I scrambled back to the Jeep, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. I knew the car wouldn't start, but the metal shell felt safer than the open air. I huddled there, clutching my knife, watching the figure through the windshield. It didn't advance. It just stood there, watching me, for hours. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers, and the darkness swallowed the clearing. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice, my voice, whispering in the dark. Around 3 a.m., I saw the flashlight beam cut through the trees. At first, I thought it was help, search and rescue maybe. The beam swept across the clearing, illuminating the trees in stark relief. I sat up, relief flooding through me. "Over here!" I shouted, pounding on the window. "I'm over here!" The beam stopped. It centered on the Jeep, blinding me. Then the light began to change. It wasn't white LED light like a modern flashlight. It was yellow, flickering, like an old incandescent bulb. And it was moving, wrong. It wasn't bobbing up and down like someone walking. It was gliding, perfectly smooth, about 8 feet off the ground. I squinted against the glare. Behind the light, I could just make out a shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, thin limbs that looked like stripped branches. And where a head should be, there was just the light, a glowing yellow orb pulsating with a sickly rhythm. It drifted closer. The light grew brighter, hotter. I could feel the heat radiating through the glass. The humming sound returned, louder now, vibrating in my teeth. Gzzz. The light flared, and for a split second I saw something in the brilliance. A mask, made of wet clay, with holes punched in it for eyes and a mouth, and inside the mouth something was moving. Then the light vanished. Darkness slammed back down like a physical weight. The humming stopped. The forest was silent again. I sat there, shaking until the sun finally broke through the trees. The The morning light revealed nothing. No tracks, no signs of the tall figure. The only evidence was a scorch mark on the hood of my Jeep, a perfect circle of blistered paint right in the center. I got out, my legs feeling like jelly. I checked the perimeter. The figure in the vest was gone, but where it had stood, there was something new. Stuck into the mud, right in the center of the logging road, was a survey stake. It was fresh wood, not weathered like the old markers, and tied to the top was a piece of flagging tape. I walked over to it, dread pooling in my stomach. Written on the tape in black marker were coordinates. N 48 degrees, 32 minutes, 15 seconds north. 121 degrees, 45 minutes, 09 seconds west. I recognized those numbers. They were the coordinates for the center of the Blackwood Tract, the heart of the old logging camp, the place the client had specifically asked me to survey in detail. And below the coordinates, in smaller, jagged letters, "Come home."
I tried to leave. I want to make that clear. I didn't just wander deeper into the woods because I'm some idiot in a horror movie. I packed a rucksack with water, a first aid kit, and my machete, and I started walking back down the logging road toward the main highway. I walked for 6 hours. My pace was steady, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and terror. I kept my head down, ignoring the feeling of eyes boring into my back, ignoring the way the trees seemed to lean in as I passed. By my calculation, I should have hit the gravel turnoff by 2 p.m., but at 2:15, the road abruptly ended. Not in a washout, and not at the highway. I stopped, my boots skidding on loose shale. I was standing in a clearing I recognized. There was the fire pit I had dug, there was my Jeep, the hood still popped, and there, nailed to the cedar tree, was the sign, "Do not speak." I had walked in a perfect 6-mile loop. I dropped my pack, the despair hitting me harder than the physical exhaustion. The road hadn't curved. I had checked my compass. I had walked straight. But the geography itself felt fluid, like the woods were reshuffling the deck every time I blinked. I looked at the survey stake again, the coordinates. Come home. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. The forest wasn't letting me leave. It was hurting me. I had two choices. Stay here and wait for the thing with the flashlight face to come back, or go where it wanted me to go and pray I could find a radio, a vehicle, or a weapon that worked. I drank half a bottle of water, gripped the machete until my knuckles turned white, and turned south, plunging into the thick brush toward the coordinates. The trek to the center of the Blackwood Tract was a descent into a different world. The vegetation changed. The ferns grew larger, their leaves sharp and serrated. The moss wasn't green anymore. It was a dark, bruised purple, hanging from the branches like entrails. And the silence? The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the squelched suck of my boots in the mud. It took me an hour to reach the destination. The heart of the tract was a natural amphitheater, a bowl in the earth shrouded in mist. In the center sat the remains of the main logging camp. It was a cluster of 3 large buildings, a bungahouse, a mess hall, and a mechanic's garage. They were rotting skeletons of wood and rusted tin, leaning precariously in the soft earth. But it was the smell that hit me first. Ozone. That sharp electric tang you smell right before a lightning strike, mixed with the copper scent of old blood. I crept toward the nearest building, the mechanic's garage. The heavy sliding doors had been torn off their hinges and lay twisted in the grass. I stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The space was cavernous, filled with the rusted hulks of old machinery, but as I moved deeper, I saw something that made me stop. The back wall of the garage was covered in stuff. It looked like a bird's nest, but massive and chaotic. Wires, cables, and extension cords were woven together with vines and strips of cloth. They formed a complex, chaotic web that stretched from floor to ceiling. And woven into this web were objects. I stepped closer, raising my flashlight.
There were radios, dozens of them. CB radios, walkie-talkies, old AM/FM portables, even a few shattered smartphones. They were all wired together, their displays cracked, their plastic casings melted. And there were other things. A rusted bear trap, a pair of broken glasses, a boot. And right in the center, dangling by its strap like a hanged man, was a digital voice recorder. My digital voice recorder. The one I had lost. When? I checked my vest pocket. It was gone. I hadn't even felt it leave my person. I reached out, my hand trembling, and brushed the play button. The speaker crackled. Point 104. Heavy brush. Come home. Point 104. Don't speak. Come home. It was a remix. A spliced, chaotic loop of my own voice, cut together with David Miller's laugh and the sound of that zipper. Zip, zip, zip. Suddenly, every speaker in the wall, every radio, every phone, every walkie-talkie lit up simultaneously. The room filled with a high-pitched whine of feedback that dropped into a low, thrumming bass. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from under the floor. The concrete slab under my feet vibrated. I looked down and saw a metal grate, rusted through, leading to a maintenance pit used for working under trucks. A pale yellow light began to glow from the darkness of the pit. And rising out of that hole, smooth as oil, came a sound. It was a phone ringing. Bring, bring. But it was too loud, too deep. It rattled my teeth. I backed away, raising the machete. "Show yourself," I screamed, the sound tearing out of my throat before I could stop it. The ringing stopped. From the pit, a voice answered. It wasn't electronic this time. It was wet, guttural. "Show yourself." A hand gripped the edge of the grate. It wasn't a hand. It was a cluster of long, pale fingers, too many of them, jointed in the wrong places. They dug into the concrete, pulverizing the stone. And then the head began to rise.
The thing that pulled itself out of the maintenance pit didn't look like an animal. It didn't look like a man. It looked like a glitched panorama photo given flesh and bone. As the head rose into the erratic light of my flashlight, I saw that it was elongated, stretched vertically as if pulled by invisible wires. The skin was pale, wet and translucent, pulsing with blue veins that looked uncomfortably like electrical wiring. But it was the face that broke me. It wasn't a face. It was a collage. The left side was smooth, featureless dough, but the right side was David Miller, or at least it was a skin graft mask of him. The eye was wide, blue, and terrified, frantically darting around the room while the rest of the creature remained perfectly still. The mouth was fused shut with what looked like black wire, stitched through the lips in a clumsy X. The creature hauled its torso onto the concrete with a sickening wet slap. It was massive, easily 7 feet long if it stood up, but it moved on all fours, its limbs possessing too many joints. They bent backwards and forwards with the fluid popping motion of a spider crab. And it was wearing clothes, or rather it had absorbed them. Shreds of an orange safety vest were embedded deep into the flesh of its shoulders, the reflective strips gleaming under the grime. The wall of radios behind me shrieked, "Show yourself." The voice boomed from the speakers, a distorted, bass-boosted loop of my own scream. The creature's head snapped toward me, the single David eye locked onto mine. Then the creature opened its mouth, not the stitched lips on the face, but a vertical slit in its throat that I hadn't noticed. It let out a sound that I can only describe as a dial-up modem screaming in pain. Adrenaline hit me like a physical blow. I didn't think. I swung. I brought the machete down with every ounce of hysterical strength I had, aiming for the cluster of fingers gripping the floor. The blade connected with a dull thud, biting deep into the pale flesh. Black fluid sprayed across the concrete, not blood, but something viscous and smelling of oil and bile. The creature didn't scream.
It just retracted the limb with blinding speed, scuttling backward into the darkness of the garage rafters like a gecko. "Run, run, run," the radios whispered now, a chorus of mocking static. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and sprinted for the gap in the garage doors, my boots slipping on the oil-slicked floor. I burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath, the fog swirling around me. I aimed for the mess hall, the largest of the three buildings. It was a solid log structure, sturdier than the garage. I hit the door with my shoulder, bursting the rusted lock, and stumbled inside. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the deadbolt. Then I dragged a heavy, overturned trestle table across the floor and wedged it against the frame. I backed away, chest heaving, sweeping my flashlight around the room. The mess hall was frozen in time. Long tables were set with rotting plastic plates. A calendar on the wall from October 1974 curled in the damp air. But in the center of the room, piled high on the serving counter, was another nest. This one wasn't made of wires. It was made of clothes. Piles of flannel shirts, denim jeans, heavy work boots, and yellow rain slickers. They were folded neatly, obsessively, into towering stacks. I walked closer, the dread settling in my gut like lead. On top of the nearest stack, a pile of faded blue work shirts, sat a wallet. I opened it. The ID inside belonged to a man named Thomas, L.I., license issue date 1998. Next to it, a set of car keys for a Ford, model year 2005. I moved down the line. There were dozens of piles, dozens of lives. Hikers, hunters, loggers, surveyors. This wasn't just a monster's lair. It was a trophy room, a catalog. Thump. The sound came from the roof. Heavy, deliberate. Thump. Scrape. Something was walking on the shingles above my head. It was slow, rhythmic, and then the scratching started. Long, slow drags of something sharp against the wood right above the center of the room. Scratch. From the darkness of the ventilation duct high on the wall, a voice drifted down. It wasn't amplified this time. It was quiet, intimate. "I see you, surveyor. I see your map." Then a small object dropped from the vent and hit the floor with a clatter. I shone my light on it. It was my prism pole, bent into a perfect circle.
I stared at the bent prism pole. It was aluminum, tough, lightweight, designed to survive being dropped off a cliff. But it had been twisted into a perfect, seamless circle. There were no tool marks, no crimping. It looked like it had been molded like clay. The scratching on the roof stopped. "What do you want?" I whispered, aiming my flashlight at the ceiling vent. Silence. Then, a low, buzzing hum began to fill the room. It wasn't coming from the vent. It was coming from everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, the rotting tables. The air itself seemed to vibrate against my eardrums. Click. A single light bulb in the center of the room flickered to life. It was an old incandescent bulb dangling from a frayed wire. It shouldn't have worked. There was no power out here, but it burned with a sickly yellow intensity. Then another bulb flared in the corner, then another. One by one, the ancient fixtures of the mess hall sputtered awake, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper. And then the music started. It was faint at first, tinny and distorted, like a radio tuned slightly off station. It was a cheerful 1950s doo-wop song. Shaboom, shaboom, life could be a dream. I spun around, trying to locate the source. The sound was coming from an old jukebox in the corner, shrouded in a heavy tarp. I ripped the canvas off. The machine was pristine, chrome gleaming under the weird light, the record spinning perfectly. But there was no record. The platter was empty. The music swelled, filling the room with manic cheerfulness. Hello, hello again, shaboom and hoping we'll meet again. Suddenly, the song cut out.
Dead silence. Then a voice boomed from the jukebox speakers. It was loud, authoritative, and terrifyingly familiar. "Attention all personnel. Shift change in 5 minutes. Report to the main office for mandatory debriefing." It was the voice of the camp foreman. I knew this because I'd heard archival recordings of him during my research for the job. He'd been dead for 40 years. "Report to the main office," the voice repeated, but this time it glitched. "Report to the main office. Report to the meat locker." The lights flared brighter, stinging my eyes. The shadows on the wall seemed to detach themselves from the furniture. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were elongated, stretching up the walls, forming shapes that looked like grasping hands. Crash! The front window of the mess hall shattered inward. I dove behind the heavy oak serving counter as glass rained down like hail. Through the broken window, I saw it. Standing in the clearing, bathed in the yellow glow of the unnatural lights, was a crowd. There were dozens of them, figures standing perfectly still in the mist. They wore faded flannel shirts, rotted denim, and hard hats. Some held axes, some held chainsaws, but none of them had faces. Where their features should have been, there was just static, a swirling gray blur like a TV tuned to a dead channel. And they were all looking at me. The jukebox crackled again. "Open the door, surveyor. We have a lot of ground to cover." The voice shifted. It was David Miller again. "Open the door, buddy. It's cold out here, and we're all so hungry." The figure at the front of the crowd, a massive man in a torn lumberjack coat, raised a chainsaw. He didn't pull a cord. The machine just roared to life on its own, the engine screaming with that same impossible organic shriek I'd heard from the creature in the garage. He stepped forward. Then another engine started, then another. A dozen chainsaws revved in unison, a mechanical choir of violence. They began to walk toward the mess hall, not running, just walking. A slow, inevitable tide of static and steel. I looked around frantically. The only other exit was a heavy steel door behind the serving counter, marked cold storage. I didn't have a choice. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. Cold air rushed out to meet me, freezing, meat locker cold. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut just as the first chainsaw bit into the wood of the front entrance. Zhee-unk! I spun the locking wheel, sealing myself in the dark. I was safe for the moment. I turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the icy fog of the locker. I wasn't alone. Sitting in the corner, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, was a man. He was skeletal, his beard long and matted, his eyes wide and unblinking in the sudden light. He raised a trembling hand to shield his eyes. "You're late," he croaked. His voice was like dry leaves crushing together. "I've been waiting for the next shift for a long time." I nearly dropped my flashlight. The man in the corner looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood. His skin was gray and papery, stretched tight over cheekbones that jutted out like cliff faces. He wore a faded green worker's uniform with a patch on the breast pocket that read, "Blackwood Logging Co., Foreman." "Who are you?" I stammered, backing up against the freezing steel door. The muffled roar of chainsaws chewing through the mess hall outside vibrated against my back. The old man didn't answer immediately. He just stared at me with watery, pale eyes that seemed to have trouble focusing. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered notebook. "Shift change," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I'm Foreman Elias. Been waiting on relief since '74. You bring the new maps?" I stared at him. 1974? That was 50 years ago. This man should be dead. He looked dead, but he was breathing. Shallow, rattling breaths that puffed into white clouds in the freezing air. "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. I'm a surveyor. I was hired to map this place, but there are things out there, things with no faces." The old man let out a dry, wheezing laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "Things? No, son, not things. The crew, the boys, they're just enthusiastic. They like the noise, the static." He tapped the side of his head. "Keeps the woods out." He stood up, his joints popping audibly. He was surprisingly tall, looming over me in the cramped space. He walked to a heavy metal shelf lined with rows of identical rusted cans. "They don't like silence," he whispered, picking up a can and shaking it. It sounded empty. "Silence lets the green in. Silence lets him in." "Him?" I asked, gripping my machete. "The thing in the garage? The mimic?" Elias's eyes widened. "The mimic? No, that's just the echo, the parrot. I'm talking about the source, the landlord." He shuffled past me to the far wall of the locker. There was no door there, just a heavy canvas tarp hanging over a hole that had been sledgehammered through the brickwork. "Come on," he said, pulling back the tarp. "Shift's over. We need to clock out before the static gets too loud." Beyond the tarp was a tunnel. Rough-hewn, dug straight into the earth, shored up with rotting timbers. It smelled of wet soil and ozone. I hesitated. Where does this go? Out or down, depends on who's listening. Crash! The heavy steel door behind me buckled inward. A chainsaw blade sparked against the metal, screeching like a banshee. The tip of the blade poked through, spinning wildly, inches from my head. I didn't argue. I followed Elias into the tunnel. We moved quickly, hunched over in the cramped passage. The air grew warmer, humid and thick. The walls were lined with strange glowing fungi, luminescent mushrooms that pulsed with a faint blue light. "Keep your head down," Elias whispered. "Don't look at the roots." I glanced up. The ceiling of the tunnel wasn't dirt. It was a dense mat of tree roots, woven together like muscle fibers. And they were moving, whirling slowly, pulsing with a dark fluid that looked like oil. "What is this place?" I hissed. "The Blackwood Tract ain't just trees, boy," Elias muttered, not breaking stride. "It's a battery, a big green battery. The company found it in '72. Thought they could tap into it. Geothermal energy, they called it. But it wasn't heat. It was memory, sound. The earth here remembers everything, and it plays it back." He stopped at a fork in the tunnel. To the left, the passage sloped upward. To the right, it plunged down into darkness. "We go left, up to the radio tower. That's the only way out. The signal jams the frequency, keeps the static confused." "Radio tower?" I asked. "I didn't see a tower on the survey maps." "Wouldn't be on your maps," Elias said grimly. "We built it after the breach, after the woods started screaming." He started up the left tunnel. I followed, but something made me look back down the right passage. Deep in the darkness, I saw a light, a yellow flickering light, and a silhouette. It was the tall figure, the one with the flashlight face. It was standing at the bottom of the slope looking up at me, and then it raised a hand and waved. "Come home," a voice whispered in my ear. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't the radio. It was inside my own head. I stumbled, nearly falling. Elias grabbed my arm with a grip like iron. "Don't listen," he hissed. "That's how he gets in. Focus on the static. Focus on the noise." He pulled a small object from his pocket, a wind-up music box mechanism. He cranked it furiously. It played a tinny, distorted version of Pop Goes the Weasel. The voice in my head faltered. The figure in the tunnel seemed to blur. "Run!" Elias shouted. We sprinted up the slope, the tunnel widening as we went. I could see light ahead, gray, misty daylight. We burst out of the ground and into the open air. We were on a high ridge, overlooking the entire Blackwood Tract. The mist had cleared enough to see the valley below, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The trees weren't trees. From this height, looking down into the bowl of the valley, the forest formed a pattern, a massive swirling spiral of green. and in the center, where the logging camp stood, the trees were pale, flesh-colored, and they were moving, swaying in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the wind. And in the very center, rising from the ruins of the camp, was a tower, but it wasn't made of steel. It was made of bones. Thousands of them, fused together into a jagged spire that scraped the sky. "That's not a radio tower," I whispered. Elias looked at me, his eyes sad. "No, that's the transmitter. We're the broadcast." He pointed to a small metal structure clinging to the edge of the cliff, a few hundred yards away. A real radio tower, rusted but standing. "That's our way out," he said. "We have to climb it. We have to change the frequency." But as we started towards it, the ground beneath us began to rumble. The bone tower in the valley let out a sound, a massive earth-shaking thrum. And then the sky tore open.
The sky didn't tear like paper. It tore like a corrupted video file. Above the valley, the gray clouds dissolved into jagged blocks of digital blackness. Through the gaps, I didn't see stars. I saw texture, a wet, pulsing green surface that looked uncomfortably like the interior of a stomach. The entire atmosphere screamed. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration that rattled your teeth and made your vision blur. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The bone tower in the center of the valley was acting as a lightning rod, pulling that sick green sky down toward us. "Move!" Elias shoved me, breaking my paralysis. "To the tower, before the signal locks on!" We sprinted toward the rusted metal skeleton on the cliff's edge. The ground beneath us was rebelling. The dirt rippled like water, roots shooting up to snag our ankles. I slashed blindly with my machete, severing tendrils that bled black oil. We reached the base of the radio tower just as the first wave of static hit. It wasn't a wave of water. It was a wave of them. From the tree line, a horde of the faceless workers poured out. They didn't run, they glided, their movements missing frames, jerking forward in impossible leaps. Their chainsaws roared in a discordant harmony that sounded like a choir of screaming metal. "Climb!" Elias yelled, pushing me toward the rusted ladder. "Get to the control box at the top. Crank the frequency to 104.5. It's the only dead channel." I grabbed the freezing metal rungs and started to haul myself up. The tower groaned, swaying violently in the impossible wind. I was 20 feet up when I heard the gunshots. I looked down. Elias wasn't climbing. He was standing at the base of the tower, holding a flare gun I hadn't seen before. He fired a red phosphorus round into the crowd of static-faced nightmares. The flare hit the lead figure, the massive lumberjack, and it didn't burn him. It erased him. The red light acted like a magnet for the glitch, sucking the static into a swirling vortex of distortion. "Go!" Elias screamed, his voice distorting, sounding like it was coming through a blown-out speaker. "I can't leave! I'm part of the broadcast!" My heart broke, but I kept climbing. 40 feet, 60 feet. The wind howled, carrying voices. My voice. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me! Come home!" I looked up. Clinging to the outside of the tower's cage, moving with the fluid grace of a spider, was the mimic, the tall, flashlight-faced entity. It was upside down, its long limbs wrapped around the steel girders. The glowing yellow orb of its face was inches from the ladder, blocking my path. The light flared, blinding me. I felt a wave of heat, smelling singeing hair. "Change the channel, baby. It's too loud." I froze. The psychological weight of that voice, so clear, so real, nearly made me let go. The creature reached out a hand. Its fingers were long, tipped with needles of bone. It wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to plug me in. Bang! A red streak hissed past my ear and struck the mimic in the chest. Below, Elias had reloaded. He was swarmed now, the faceless workers tearing at his clothes, but he had taken the shot. The mimic shrieked, a sound of pure digital agony, and lost its grip. It fell,
tumbling past me, dissolving into a cloud of yellow pixels before it even hit the ground. "Elias!" I screamed. I looked down. The foreman was gone, buried under a mound of writhing, static-filled bodies. But from the pile, I heard his voice, amplified, booming over the valley. "Shift change! Everyone out! Mandatory evacuation!" A massive explosion of red light engulfed the base of the tower. He had fired the last flare into the fuel tank of the generator at the base. The explosion shook the tower violently, nearly throwing me off. The heat surged up, singeing my eyebrows. But the explosion did something else. It disrupted the horde. They flickered and vanished, rebooting. I scrambled up the last 20 feet, my lungs burning, my hands bleeding. I vaulted over the railing onto the small maintenance platform at the top. There it was, the transmitter box. It was an ancient gray metal cabinet, rusted shut. I smashed the lock with the hilt of my machete and tore the door open. Inside there were no digital displays, just a series of heavy copper switches and a large rotary frequency dial. The dial was set to 0.0. The air around me began to hum. The bone tower in the distance was glowing now, a beam of pure green energy shooting straight up into the torn sky. The thrum was becoming a physical pressure, squeezing my brain. I grabbed the dial. It was stuck, corroded by decades of rain and neglect. "Come home," the air whispered. "Come home." The platform shuddered. A hand, pale, elongated, and dripping with oil, slammed onto the railing. The mimic hadn't been destroyed. It had just rebooted, and it was pulling itself up over the edge, the flashlight face cracked and leaking yellow fluid. I gripped the dial with both hands, planted my feet, and screamed.
The mimic hauled its torso over the railing. Up close, the face was even worse than I had imagined. The yellow light wasn't a bulb, it was bioluminescence, swirling behind a translucent membrane of skin. Through the fluid, I could see the skull beneath. It wasn't human. It was canine. A wolf's skull, elongated and cracked, suspended in that glowing gel. It opened its mouth. "Don't touch that dial," it whispered. It spoke with my father's voice. My dad has been dead for 10 years. Hearing him clear as day, standing on a radio tower in a hellish green nightmare, nearly broke my mind right there. "It's lonely out there, son. Stay with us. We have so much work to do." Tears blurred my vision. My hands were slipping on the rusted metal of the frequency knob. The air pressure was crushing me, making my nose bleed, the blood dripping onto the control panel. "You're not him," I sobbed, closing my eyes. "You just an echo." I gripped the dial with everything I had. My muscles screamed. The veins in my arms felt like they were going to burst. The mimic lunged, its needle fingers hooking into my shoulder, piercing the canvas of my vest and biting into flesh. I didn't let go. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore my throat and twisted. Crack! The rust gave way. The dial spun freely. I slammed it to the right, watching the needle jump. 88.0, 92.0, 101.0. The mimic shrieked. It wasn't a voice anymore, it was the sound of a feedback loop tearing itself apart. The yellow light in its face began to strobe violently, turning from yellow to a deep, bruising purple. 104.5. I let go of the dial. The silence was instantaneous. The thrum vanished. The green sky didn't fade, it shattered like a mirror dropped on concrete. The shards of digital blackness fell away, revealing the dull, gray, comforting overcast of a Washington afternoon. The mimic paused. The light in its face went out. It looked down at its own hands, which were beginning to smoke. It tried to speak, but only a soft hiss of static came out. Then gravity seemed to remember it existed. The creature slumped, losing its grip on the railing. It tipped backward, falling silently into the mist below. I looked out over the valley. The bone tower was gone. The spiral of trees was gone.
There was just a forest, a dense, quiet, ugly forest. Then the adrenaline crashed. My legs gave out, and the world went black. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Bellingham. According to the official report, a search and rescue team found me wandering the shoulder of Highway 20, dehydrated, hypothermic, and rambling about radio frequencies. They said I had walked nearly 30 miles. There was no mention of a radio tower, no mention of Elias, no mention of a logging camp. When I was discharged, I found a package waiting for me at my apartment. It was a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $45,000, triple the agreed amount. There was also a note. It was typed on heavy, expensive paper. Services rendered. Contract complete. Do not return to the coordinates. The survey is closed. I took the money. I paid off my debts. I sold my Jeep. I moved to the city, as far away from the tree line as I could get. I work in an office now, drafting CAD files. I don't go outside when it rains. But here's the thing. Here's why I'm writing this to you. I didn't come back with all my gear. I left my tripod. I left my machete. But when the rescue team found me, apparently I had one thing clutched in my hand so tight they had to pry my fingers open to get it. It was my digital voice recorder. I haven't turned it on. I can't. It sits in a lockbox in the bottom of my closet, wrapped in duct tape. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is dead quiet, I can hear it. Not the recorder itself, but a sound coming from the closet. It's faint. You have to really listen for it. It sounds like a zipper. Zzz, zzz, and then a whisper. My voice. Is anyone there? We're still waiting. I think part of me never came down from that tower. I think part of me is still out there, in the static, waiting for the broadcast to start again. So if you're ever in the North Cascades and you see a survey marker with orange tape, or you find a radio that plays nothing but white noise, don't touch it. And for God's sakes, do not speak, because something is always listening.